Caledonian Airways Flight 153 was a scheduled international flight that tragically ended in disaster on March 4, 1962, when a Douglas DC-7 crashed into a swamp near Douala, Cameroon. The accident claimed the lives of all 111 people on board, making it one of the deadliest aviation accidents of its time. The flight, operated by Caledonian Airways, was a chartered service carrying passengers from Luxembourg to Douala, with multiple stops along the way. The circumstances surrounding the crash, as later determined by investigators, pointed to a series of human errors that culminated in the fatal impact. On that fateful day, the aircraft was in the final stages of its journey, preparing for its approach to Douala International Airport. The weather was not particularly adverse, but there were reports of some localized thunderstorms and reduced visibility due to haze. The crew, consisting of an experienced captain and a competent first officer, had been managing the flight smoothly up to that point. However, as they descended towards their destination, a series of miscalculations and errors in judgment would lead to the catastrophe. The Douglas DC-7, a four-engine propeller-driven aircraft, was one of the most advanced long-haul planes of its time. It was designed for endurance and reliability, yet it required careful handling, particularly during approach and landing phases. The approach to Douala required careful navigation, as the airport was surrounded by challenging terrain, including swamps and forests. The crew was expected to follow standard procedures, including maintaining the correct altitude and adhering to designated waypoints before initiating the final descent. As the aircraft approached Douala, it was cleared for descent. The captain, likely fatigued from the long journey, miscalculated the descent profile. The aircraft was descending faster than recommended, and the crew failed to cross-check their altitude with the prescribed minimums. The situation was exacerbated by a possible misunderstanding between the pilots and air traffic control regarding the exact altitude they were supposed to maintain before making their final approach. One of the critical factors in the crash was the failure to adhere to instrument procedures. The Douglas DC-7 was equipped with navigational aids that should have assisted the pilots in maintaining the correct glide path. However, investigators later determined that the crew had either misinterpreted these instruments or relied too heavily on visual cues despite the presence of haze and reduced visibility. This reliance on visual approach in a low-visibility environment was a crucial mistake that significantly contributed to the disaster. As the aircraft continued its descent, it was flying lower than it should have been. The crew, possibly realizing their error too late, attempted to correct their altitude. However, by the time corrective action was initiated, the aircraft had already entered a critical phase where recovery was no longer possible. The dense, swampy terrain offered little margin for error, and within moments, the DC-7 crashed violently into the ground. The impact was catastrophic, with the aircraft breaking apart and catching fire almost immediately. Rescue efforts were severely hampered by the location of the crash. The swampy environment made it difficult for emergency responders to reach the site quickly. When rescuers finally arrived, they found no survivors. The crash site was a devastating scene with wreckage scattered over a large area and the aircraft completely destroyed. The loss of all 111 lives sent shockwaves through the aviation industry and prompted an immediate investigation into the causes of the accident. The official investigation, conducted by aviation authorities, focused on several key aspects, including pilot performance, navigational procedures, and the role of air traffic control in the incident. The final report concluded that the primary cause of the crash was pilot error. Specifically, the report highlighted the crew's failure to maintain the correct altitude during the approach phase, as well as their over-reliance on visual cues. In suboptimal visibility conditions, In addition to pilot error, the report also noted potential lapses in communication between the flight crew and air traffic control. There were indications that instructions regarding altitude and approach procedures may not have been fully understood or properly executed. While there was no evidence of mechanical failure, the investigation did recommend improvements in procedural training for pilots, particularly in instrument approach techniques. The crash of Caledonian Airways Flight 153 served as a sobering reminder of the critical importance of strict adherence to approach procedures, especially in challenging environments. It reinforced the necessity for pilots to rely on their instruments rather than visual cues when operating in conditions of reduced visibility. As a result of the findings, Caledonian Airways, along with other airlines operating similar aircraft, implemented more rigorous training programs to ensure that pilots were better equipped to handle instrument approaches safely. Beyond the technical and procedural aspects, the disaster had a profound impact on the families of the victims. The loss of 111 lives was a devastating tragedy, leaving behind grieving relatives who sought answers and accountability. Aviation safety at the time was still evolving, and while flying was generally safe, accidents like Flight 153 underscored the need for continuous improvements in training, procedures, and communication. In the years following the crash, the aviation industry introduced several key advancements aimed at preventing similar tragedies. One of the major changes was the increased emphasis on crew resource management, CRM, which encouraged better communication and decision-making among flight crews. Additionally, improvements in approach and landing procedures were implemented, with more stringent requirements for instrument-based approaches, particularly in areas with challenging terrain or unpredictable weather conditions. Another significant outcome of the investigation was the push for better coordination between pilots and air traffic controllers. The Flight 153 crash highlighted the dangers of miscommunication and underscored the need for standardized phraseology and clearer directives in air traffic control communications. This led to refinements in how instructions were conveyed, reducing the likelihood of misunderstandings that could lead to tragic consequences. While the memory of Flight 153 remains a tragic chapter in aviation history, its lessons contributed to the ongoing evolution of flight safety. Every major accident serves as a catalyst for change, driving improvements that ultimately make air travel safer for future generations. The passengers and crew of Caledonian Airways Flight 153 may have been lost, but their legacy endures in the safety measures and procedural advancements that were shaped by the investigation into their final flight.